I almost didn't let him in. Not because I disliked him. I didn't even know him yet. But I was working. And when I'm working, I don't want to stop. It was the fall of 1947. I was 29 years old, still carrying the weight of Los Alamos, still carrying the weight of Arlene. I had come to Cornell to try to become a physicist again, to remember why I loved this. And then someone knocked on my door and told me there was a young Englishman asking to speak with me. His name was Freeman Dyson. He was 23 years old, and within 6 months I began to wonder if I had ever really understood what intelligence was. Let me tell you about the world I was living in then. Physics was in chaos. Beautiful. Electric chaos. Quantum electrodynamics, the theory of how light and matter interact, was a wreck. The equations gave nonsensical answers. Infinities everywhere. You would calculate the mass of an electron and get infinity. You would calculate the charge and get infinity. Something was deeply, obviously wrong. But there were hints. In 1947, Willis Lamb measured something strange, a tiny shift in the energy levels of hydrogen that the existing theory couldn't explain. We called it the Lamb shift. It was a crack in the wall, and every serious physicist in the world was trying to climb through it. Julian Schwinger had a method, a very beautiful, very complicated, very formal method. He gave a lecture on it at a conference in the Pocono Mountains that year. It took him 6 hours. 6 hours of the most elaborate, elegant mathematics you have ever seen. When he was done, the room was silent. Not because people were bored, because they were stunned. I had a method too. My method. The pictures. The little diagrams I drew to track where the electrons went and what the photons were doing. I presented mine at the same conference. It did not go as well as Schwinger's. Bohr stood up in the middle of my talk and told me I was violating the uncertainty principle. He was wrong, but I couldn't explain it clearly enough in the moment. I sat down feeling like I had made a fool of myself. Schwinger's version was rigorous. Mine looked like I was drawing cartoons. So that was the world when Freeman Dyson knocked on my door. He came from Cambridge. He had studied mathematics, pure mathematics, under G.H. Hardy, one of the greatest mathematicians of the century. He had not done a Ph.D. He had simply read everything, thought about everything, and arrived in America at Cornell to learn physics from Hans Bethe. The first time we really talked, I noticed something. He listened differently. Most people, when you explain something to them, you can watch them working. You can see them catching up. You can see the moment of understanding cross their face. With Freeman, there was none of that. He just looked at you, quiet, still, and then when you were done, he would say something that was 3 steps ahead of where you had finished. It was unsettling. I took him on a long car trip that summer. Just the 2 of us, driving across the country, talking physics. Days on the road, I would explain my diagrams. I would show him how I thought about the electrons, how I tracked the paths, how the pictures encoded the mathematics without making you do the mathematics first. He asked very few questions. He mostly listened, and I remember thinking either he is understanding everything perfectly or he is completely lost and too proud to say so. It was not the second one. Here is what disturbed me. A few months after that road trip, Schwinger gave another lecture. And there was also, by then, a third approach to quantum electrodynamics, a version developed by a Japanese physicist named Shinichiro Tomonaga, who had been working completely independently during the war, isolated in Japan, and had arrived at something similar to Schwinger's method entirely on his own. 3 separate approaches to the same problem. Schwinger's was formal and algebraic. Tomonaga's was similar in spirit. Mine was geometric and visual. They all gave the same answers, but nobody had proven that they were equivalent. They looked completely different. The formalisms were different. The philosophies were different. The way you thought while doing them was different. Freeman Dyson sat down and proved they were all the same theory. That's not the disturbing part. The disturbing part is how he did it. He didn't extend any one of our methods. He didn't start from Schwinger's formalism and work toward mine. He invented an entirely new formalism, one that none of us had thought of. And then he showed that all 3 of our approaches were special cases of this new thing he had built. He didn't climb the mountain. He rose above it and looked down and showed us that what we thought were 3 different mountains were actually one. He was 24 years old. The thing about Freeman's mind, I spent a lot of time trying to understand how his mind worked. I'm a curious person. Always have been. And here was something I genuinely could not figure out. My mind works in pictures. I've said this before. When I do physics, I see things. I see electrons moving. I see the arrows, the paths, the little jiggling of light. The mathematics comes second, the picture comes first, and the picture tells me what is true, and then I go back and write down the equations that say what the picture showed me. Schwinger's mind worked in the opposite direction. Pure formalism, elaborate, crystalline structure. He built cathedrals out of symbols, and they were beautiful, but you had to already believe in the architecture before you could live inside them. Freeman was neither of these. When I asked him how he thought, he had a hard time explaining it. He said it was more like reading a landscape, seeing where the mathematical structures were continuous and where they had discontinuities, seeing the shape of an argument the way you might see the shape of a hillside from a distance before you've walked it. He could look at a formalism he had never seen before and immediately locate the places where it was fragile, where it was secretly making assumptions it hadn't declared, where it was doing something clever that would break down under generalization. I had to play with a theory for weeks before I trusted it. Freeman could read its character in an afternoon. The conversation that stayed with me. We were at Cornell, late in the evening. I was working through something, getting frustrated. Freeman was sitting nearby, reading. I said something out loud, not really to him, just thinking aloud about why a particular approach wasn't working. He looked up from his book. He thought for maybe 4 seconds, and then he told me exactly what the obstruction was. Not approximately, exactly. The precise structural reason why the method I was trying would fail, and the precise class of methods that could succeed. I stared at him. I said, "Did you already know this problem?" He said, "No." I said, "How long have you been listening to me talk about it?" He said, "Since just now." 4 seconds. I had been working on this particular frustration for 3 days. He had listened to me mutter for 30 seconds and identified the root cause in 4 seconds. I didn't feel jealous. I want to be honest about that. It wasn't jealousy. It was something more like vertigo. The feeling you get when the ground shifts under you. When something you thought was stable turns out to be floating. I had thought I was good at this. I was good at this. But there was a mode of thought happening inside Freeman Dyson's head that I could not fully see, could not fully track, and could not access for myself. And that was genuinely disorienting. But here's the thing I noticed eventually. Freeman could synthesize, he could unify, he could take separate things and show they were one thing. He could see the deep structure underneath, apparent difference. That was his extraordinary gift, but he did not invent the things he unified. My diagrams were strange and ugly, and people didn't trust them at first. But they came from somewhere new. They came from a way of seeing that didn't exist before I drew them. Schwinger's formalism was almost impossibly ornate, but it opened a door that hadn't existed. Tamanaga had built his version in wartime isolation, with almost no resources, driven by something that looked almost like stubbornness about the truth. Freeman took these 3 acts of creation and showed they were coherent. That was its own genius, a profound and rare genius. But it was a different operation than what had created the things he was connecting. I once asked him gently what he was working on that was new. He got quiet, and then he said something I have thought about ever since. He said he sometimes worried that he was better at understanding other people's ideas than generating his own, that he was a translator of genius rather than a source of it. I told him that was ridiculous. What he had done with QED was not translation. It was transformation. He had not explained our theories to each other. He had seen something about the structure of reality that none of us had seen, and his proof of equivalence was not a footnote to our work. It was a foundation under it. He nodded, but I could tell he didn't fully believe me. What it told me about intelligence. Freeman Dyson made me realize there is a type of mind that science doesn't talk about enough. We celebrate the inventor, the person who stands in the dark and pulls something out of nothing. Einstein seeing the relativity of simultaneity. Bohr seeing the quantum atom. Me, if I'm being honest, seeing the path integral. These are the moments we remember. The lightning strikes. But there is another kind of genius. The one who comes after the lightning. Who looks at the scorched earth and says, I see what happened here. I see how it connects to that other strike over there. And that one. And that one. And here is the unified map. That mind is not derivative. It is not less creative. It is operating in a different register. And in some ways, I say this carefully, it may be rarer. Because to unify, you have to hold multiple complex systems in your head simultaneously, keep them all alive, feel where they are secretly touching, and then construct the bridge between them, without distorting any of them, without collapsing the distinctions that matter, knowing which differences are superficial and which are real. That is not simple work, it is not lesser work, it is different work. The strange sadness here is what disturbed me most, not Freeman's ability. I was not disturbed by his ability. I was disturbed by what I saw underneath it. For all that his mind could do, and it could do things mine could not, Freeman Dyson spent much of his life with a quiet uncertainty about his own place in physics. He kept moving. Not because he had conquered each area, because he worried he was not contributing to it in the way that would be remembered. He worked on nuclear reactors, on space propulsion, on arms control, on climate, on biology, on the foundations of quantum mechanics, on the nature of intelligence, and the long-term future of life. He was extraordinarily good in every one of these areas. Papers that other people would consider the crown of their careers, Freeman wrote as digressions, but there was always this question underneath, this thing he was looking for, the discovery that would feel to him like the ones he had unified rather than the one who had unified them. I think he never quite found it, and I think that was a sadness he carried. What Los Alamos had already taught me. I had watched von Neumann at Los Alamos. Johnny, the most powerful, calculating mind who ever lived. He had told people privately that he would be forgotten, that Gödel would be remembered, and he would not. And now here was Freeman Dyson, who had published one of the most important papers in 20th century physics before he was 25, who would eventually be elected a Fellow of the Royal Society, who would write books that 3 generations of scientists and non-scientists would love. And he carried this same quiet doubt, not a paralyzing doubt. They both kept working. They both produced more in a slow week than most physicists produce in a year. But the doubt was there, underneath, always. And I started to think, is this just what it feels like to be a certain kind of mind? Is it the price of seeing clearly? When you can see the landscape of knowledge from a height, you can also see how much is still dark, how much territory you have not mapped, how many questions are still sitting there unanswered, staring back at you. Maybe the people who are most confident are the ones who can't see how much there is to know. Maybe doubt and intelligence are not opposites. Maybe doubt is intelligence's shadow. The last thing I'll say about him, Freeman Dyson lived to be 96 years old. He outlived almost everyone I knew. He kept writing. He kept thinking, right up until the end. I didn't live that long. I would have liked to. But the thing I want you to take from this is not the story of his ability. It's the story of his uncertainty. Because if you are sitting somewhere right now wondering whether your mind works the way it is supposed to work, whether you are being creative enough, whether your ideas are truly original, whether the way you think is a contribution or just a reaction to what other people have already thought, Freeman Dyson would like a word with you. His mind unified quantum electrodynamics, held 3 incompatible formalisms inside his head simultaneously, and found the hidden country they all lived in. And he still wondered, privately, whether he had really contributed. So stop being so sure that your doubts are telling you the truth. The people who do not doubt themselves are not the most capable. They are simply the ones who have stopped looking at how much remains to be done. Freeman never stopped looking, and that is exactly why he never stopped doubting, and that is exactly why he never stopped working. And that, more than the unification of quantum electrodynamics, is the thing I learned from watching Freeman Dyson's mind. If this story meant something to you, hit subscribe. I tell stories like this about the real lives of the scientists who changed how we see the world. I'll see you in the next one.